For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hi, welcome to another exciting podcast adventure on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet, and today we're going to be talking about Revelation 2, verses 18 and 19. Corresponds to section 25 in my book if you want to get the nutshell version of what I'm going to be talking about today. These two verses essentially deal with the commendations to the saints in Thyatira. So today we're starting the fourth of the seven churches and the letters that John wrote to each of the seven churches. As we begin today, pose to yourself this question: what does this really have to do with me? Because today we're going to be talking about the commendations to the Thyatiran saints. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the condemnations of those same saints. They're probably not the same. Some are good, some are bad, some are in between probably. But at any rate, it's a question I think that needs to be asked. Why did the Lord preserve this particular book for me to receive here in the last days? And why are they the prophecies that John will prophesy again in the latter days? And that, of course, includes the going forth of the book of Revelation. So just give that question some food for thought, and we're going to circle back when we get down toward the end of the podcast today. We begin with Revelation 2:18, which says, quote, "And unto the angel of the church in Thyatira write, These things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass." Close quote. So as I mentioned, this is the fourth letter that John has written to the seven churches. The reference to the angel of the church, of course, means the servant, the pastoral leader, bishop, elder, whatever you want to call that person back anciently. That's what the angel symbolizes, and so the letter is being written to the servant or bishop in Thyatira. It's the same in all seven letters, as I've discussed before. Now, by way of just a brief background, if we look at our world-famous map, we can see where the city of Thyatira is located in relationship to the other seven cities. It was a small, thriving town about 30 to 40 miles southeast of Pergamos on the road to Sardis. Now, this was not a major trade route, but it was a route that sufficiently supported the trade guilds and other types of guilds that existed in Thyatira that would have included leather workers, bakers, coppersmiths, clothiers, but probably the most important industry in this city would have been the dyers guild, meaning those who dyed clothing, specifically expensive clothing. So the city was kind of renowned for its purple dye, which in purple clothing was very much a luxury item, and the waters in the area of Thyatira seemed to be perfectly equipped for the dyeing of these scarlet colors or these brilliant purple colors that were also made very permanent as the clothes were dyed. The red purple dyes come from a shellfish. I don't know if the shellfish was specifically from those waters, but the two of them together essentially came up with a pretty good product. You can go ahead and get more information about the geopolitical aspects of the city by taking a look at the podcast I did. It's called CFM number 7, or Come Follow Me number 7, on November 12 of 2023. So go back there and you'll get more information about this and all the other cities. Now, it's important to note that with this being the fourth letter, it just so happens that this is the longest letter of the seven, but it's also to the church that was in the smallest city. So this, among all seven, was going to be the least known and least important of all the seven cities. Today, it's known as the modern city of Asahar in Turkey, and that city essentially sits on the top of the ruins of ancient Thyatira. The name means White Castle, and the reason it has this name is because white marble is pretty abundant in this location, and there's really no trace of past Christianity in the modern town. So with that little bit of an introduction, I want to kind of mention by way of introduction the name of a woman by the name of Lydia, who was a wealthy businesswoman from Thyatira. She's not mentioned in the letter itself, but because she tends to be the antithesis of this woman named Jezebel, who is also from Thyatira that we're going to learn about tomorrow, I want to bring her to your attention now. And she's mentioned in Acts 16:14, where it says, quote, "And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul." Close quote. So this woman called Lydia, seller of purple, meaning she was probably a member of the Dyers Guild. Her trade was in dyeing clothing, selling clothing. Now, she was converted in the city of Philippi, but this verse specifically says that she was from the city of Thyatira. And so, given what we know about her from her relationship to Paul, it appears that she was probably a woman of considerable means, just based on the size of her house in Philippi, because after she was converted to the gospel, Paul and the other missionaries, at least 4 men, plus her household, and plus if Paul was traveling with some others that were attending to them, could have been there as well. So at any rate, it was a pretty large party. It kind of reminds me when I was in my mission in Holland, you've got Paul staying, and his missionaries staying in the same household with women, and we had an incident that occurred when I was the district leader in Gouda, and the church was located on the bottom floor of this building, but the missionaries stayed in an apartment. And we stayed with, well, I didn't, but some of the missionaries stayed with a member who lived in kind of this apartment that was located in connection with the church. And so you got missionaries staying with the guy, no problem, right? Well, then his sister comes for a visit. And so, we all got to figure out, now what are we going to do? And she wasn't going to be there that long, few days, whatever. And, the rules basically say you can't have the missionary staying in the same household where there's a single woman also residing, even if it's only temporary. And so I had to make this big decision, to let him stay and just kind of look the other way, or make them come sleep on my floor in my apartment. But you know what they were voting for. But ultimately I said, no, we can't have you staying over there as long as she's there. And so I made them come and sleep on my floor, and they were none too happy. So there's a little bit of weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth, which was 2 other little asides. My floor in my Holland is a country that a good portion of it, particularly over on the eastern side of the country, is all pretty much below sea level, and so it tends to be on kind of soft ground. It's a lot of the ground is land that had been reclaimed from the sea, and so some of it's a little bit mushy. And so the house I was living in, between a wall, it was probably maybe 12 feet across, and I'm sure that the elevation in that 12-foot span probably dropped at least 6 inches, maybe almost a foot. So the house was kind of leaning. So they not only got to come and sleep on my floor, but they got to sleep on a floor that you could only have your head in one direction if you wanted to have it your head higher than your feet. But at any rate, that was a little experience we had in Holland. I can tell you apartment stories like crazy. Another one when I was in Rotterdam, we were up on the third floor and the roof fell in, of all things. So at any rate, it's kind of amazing how missionaries survive, but it's a great experience. But needless to say, if Paul and his missionaries had been in my district when I was the district leader, he would not have been able to stay with Lydia and her household. So count your lucky stars, Paul, that you didn't have me as your district leader. Okay, but anyway, getting back to our story here. So the fact that Lydia was a successful businesswoman suggests that she probably had charge of her local guild in Philippi, and she would have received her clothing, the dyed clothing, from her native town, which she would then sell in Philippi. As a result of her conversion to the gospel of Jesus Christ, she probably had to give up her prosperous business, because being a Christian was very much inconsistent with being the member of a local trade guild. And the reason is because the guild meetings, what we would call today labor unions, essentially, at the union gatherings, they would offer incense to their patron deity or the emperor. They would eat meats that had been sacrificed to idols. And so it made it very, very difficult for you to be in a position, particularly a position of leadership in the guild, if you no longer participated in those kinds of things. And we kind of talked about that before, how these things were somewhat socially required in order to fit in with the society. Now, her name and trade may also suggest that she was a freed woman, meaning at some point in time she was a former slave who was then freed by her master. And this is not unusual at all, that many traders in the various guilds, including the Dyers Guild, were at times slaves, but at some point they would be freed by their master, but they would continue to work as agents in their former master's businesses. And so the circumstances of Lydia may suggest that at some point in time she was a slave and then freed and became successful in her trade. Now, Lydia was one of Paul's earliest converts in Philippi. Some even say she was his first convert to Christianity in all of Europe, or at least in Philippi. Philippi was a somewhat interesting city, because it was a Roman colony that had Roman citizens kind of placed there for military purposes, and it was governed directly from Rome, independent of the provincial magistrates. It's a little bit like Washington, D.C. in the sense that you have the District of Columbia that is governed by the federal government and does not have its own state government. And so that's a little bit like the connection to Philippi. Not that it was something that was elevated above cities, but essentially it was like people were there it was a military outpost, not subject to local control and authorities. So what else do we know about Lydia? Well, she was a Gentile woman who worshiped with the Jews prior to her conversion to Christianity. This may suggest that she was in fact a proselyte, which means a Gentile, a Greek person who then became a convert of Judaism. But it's not clear that Lydia actually converted to Judaism before she converted to Christianity. So she may have gone straight from having some type of pagan religion or pagan practices to being a Christian. But in any event, whether she was a proselyte or not, it's clear that she and her extended household converted to Christianity and were baptized, and this then became the home base for Paul's mission to Philippi. Now, having given you this detail about her, keep all this information in the back of your mind a little bit, because tomorrow we're going to talk about Jezebel of Thyatira. And so you've got two women that are from Thyatira, one on the extreme end of goodness and other on the extreme end of wickedness. And so they become antithetical to each other, and Jezebel is someone that is just really, really bad. And so we'll get a chance to talk about her some more tomorrow when we talk about the next verses. So let's talk about Thyatira and the kind of worship that was occurring in this particular city. This city was pretty much famous for its worship of the sun, which of course is one of the oldest and most pervasive forms of idolatry that existed in the ancient world, which is somewhat understandable because you got the splendor of the sun that would make it a natural object of adoration. I mean, think about all the people that we have on the beaches today in their skimpy bathing suits. Worshiping the sun, taking it in, being blessed with this tanned skin from spending their time on the beach in their adoration of the rays and the UV. So at any rate, this worship of the sun was as ancient as the oldest empire that existed after the flood, and that was, of course, Egypt. And in Egypt, the sun god was a guy by the name of Ra, R-A, and his seat was at Heliopolis, which was one of the oldest and major cities in ancient Egypt. In Hebrew, the name of this city would be Beth Shemesh, which is the house of the sun. Beth being house, Shemesh being the sun, that you find recorded in Jeremiah 43:13. And so the Jews had been repeatedly warned against engaging in this form of idolatry, but of course they at times fell into the problem of doing so anyway. It's kind of interesting because you may remember the story where Joshua caused the sun to stand still, and this basically showed that Jehovah is the Lord of the sun. And so that's some of the information about this particular type of worship. Now, the city of itself was rebuilt by a Greek by the name of Seleucus Nicator in the period of time between 301 and 281 BC. And at the time he built the city, it was the location for the temple of the Lydian sun god Tyrimnos. And so when that eventually evolves and becomes part of the Roman Empire with the fall of the Greek Empire, then the Roman name kind of comes in and takes the place of Tyrimnos, and the Roman god then becomes Apollo. But essentially, they're the same form of worship. Now, in this city, there were also games that were held in honor of Tyrimnos, and you have certain coins that were fashioned that depicted this god as a horseman with a double-headed battle axe. And so by the 1st century AD, of course, we have the Romans who are in control. Apollo is now the god that is worshipped in this city, and he was the Roman sun god, or the god of light. And the temple named after Tyrimnos, now Apollo, would be the equivalent of the son of Zeus. And so Apollo was the primary god of the pagans in Thyatira when John wrote his letter. And this letter and the form in which it is written, the symbolism and some of the attributes that are described, confronts directly the worship of Apollo. And how does it doing? It is because when the letter is written, as it starts out in verse 18, it says, "These things saith the Son of God." Okay, so you've got kind of a play on words that is going here. And it's kind of interesting that this is the only time in the book of Revelation where the title Son of God is used. In all other places, his attributes are mentioned. And so if you go back to Revelation chapter 1 and you read through a description of the Savior kind of head to foot, his white hair, his blazing eyes of flame of fire, all the way down till you get down to his feet of this glowing brass or bronze color. You've got all of those attributes, and not once is he referred to as the Son of God. We do have, of course, in Revelation 1:13, where it mentions that he stood in the midst of the seven candlesticks as one like unto the Son of Man. So we have the Son of Man, but not the Son of God. And they're effectively the same thing, because it's the Son of the Man of Holiness, who is God. And so they're synonymous. But it's important to make the distinction here, because the message that is being written here is to confront this worship of the sun god, who is Apollo. And so what we have here as the Son of God is the relation back of the attributes to Revelation 1:14 and 15, where it's described that he had this eyes as a flame of fire. So that you have this pattern of matching one of his titles to the conditions in the community. And Thyatira claimed its divine guardian was the sun god. That's S-U-N God, not S-O-N, but the divine patron in Thyatira, the sun god Apollos, or the sun god. Well, here we're now going to be confronting Apollo, or the sun god, S-U-N God, with the true God, who is the protector of Thyatira, who is the Son of God, the S-O-N of God. So we've got this kind of a play on words that is going on here, and we have the same play on words of Son, S-U-N, and Son, S-O-N, in Malachi chapter 2, which refers to Christ as the Son of Righteousness, using S-U-N, not the Son of Righteousness, S-O-N. But if you go to 3 Nephi 25 chapter 2, where the Savior was visiting among the Nephites, and he wanted to make sure that they had some of the prophecies of Malachi that were important prophecies concerning the second resurrection. There it's interesting, because the Savior refers to himself as the Son of Righteousness, S-O-N. So let me quote the verse for you and kind of circle back on this, because it can be a little confusing. It says, quote, "But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and ye shall go forth and grow up as calves in the stall." Close quote. So again, in Nephi, it's the Son of Righteousness, S-O-N, in contrast to Malachi 2, which is Son of Righteousness, S-U-N. But both of them are playing on this concept of the sun, the glory, and the light, and these types of things. Okay, so now moving on in this verse, it says that the Son of God has eyes like unto flame of fire, and his feet are like brass. And so these are the features that have been taken from Revelation 1:14 and 15, where it said, quote, "His head and hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters." Close quote. So these flaming eyes again identify Jesus Christ as the one true God of light, which we discussed in my podcast from January 21st, as I mentioned a moment ago. If you look at other verses that have the same type of description, take a look at 1 John 1:5, which says, quote, "This then is the message which we have heard of him, and declare unto you that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." Close quote. We get a further definition of this light in Doctrine and Covenants section 93:2, which says, quote, "I am the true light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world." Close quote. And finally, in Doctrine and Covenants section 88 verse 7, it says, "This is the light of Christ, as also he is in the sun, and the light of the sun, and the power thereof by which it was made." Close quote. So all of these verses again tell us about the Father and the Son being a true God of light, and it relates everything from a spiritual condition on one end to the very physical power of the light of the sun at the other end of a continuum. This verse also describes Christ's feet as this highly polished brass. Comes from a Greek word, chalkilobiano, that is also used in Revelation 1:15, and it's a type of burnished bronze. And the Greek word that it comes from is a very rare word, and so a specific word was chosen to try and describe something about the feet of Jesus Christ. With this one particular words. Now, bronze is an alloy from a number of metals characterized by brilliance when polished, and that's what this word is attempting to describe. So one of the exports of Thyatira was a good quality brass. It's an alloy of copper and zinc. Bronze, on the other hand, is an alloy primarily of copper and tin or other metals, but in either case, the feet of brass are a symbol of power and strength and dominion, with power to tread upon and destroy the wicked, including Thyatira's imitation anti-Christian sun god. That's the main message that is being conveyed by these feet of highly polished brass. So let's move on now to Revelation 2:19 that says, quote, "I know thy works and charity and service and faith and thy patience, and thy works, and the last to be more than the first." Close quote. Now this phrase, "I know thy works," of course, appears in all 7 letters to all 7 churches, and they are a description of Christ's omniscience. And so if we circle back to the question that I posed about what does this letter have to do with you, one of the things you have to understand, whatever it is you're doing in your life, whether it be works of charity, service, faith, and patience, or less noble actions, Christ is aware of them. He knows them. He is omniscient. And so this verse is also somewhat noteworthy because it says the works twice in the same verse. And so he gives this general description, "I know thy works." Then he goes into the specifics of the works that he specifically knows and the specific actions. And so it starts out, of course, first of all, with charity, which is the Greek agape type of love, which is the pure love of Christ that is much discussed by Paul, particularly in 1 Corinthians 13. The second type or attribute of work is the attribute of service, which is coincident to a ministry. So when we think of service, you think of the types of things you are doing in your ministry for Jesus Christ, and recognize, of course, that service is the essence of godhood. It is synonymous with keeping the commandments of God, and it is a key to our spiritual development. So I like to say that service sanctifies. It is a principle with a promise. It is well illustrated in the parable of the sheep and goats found in Matthew chapter 25. You'll recall that as the Savior was talking about these sheep and these goats, he's talking about the service that was given by someone who came and clothed him when he was naked, gave him to drink when he was thirsty, came and visited him when he was in prison. And the person hearing the parable says, "You know what? I don't really remember feeding you when you were hungry, or clothing you when you were naked, or giving you to drink when you were thirsty." Now, and frankly, I think I would remember if I came to see you in prison, and I don't remember that. And of course the Savior then, in that famous verse in Matthew 25:40 says, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Close quote. And so essentially the service that is rendered, whether it be to Christ directly or more often and more typically to his friends and those who are his followers, and to our neighbors and people who maybe even be our enemies. The service is the defining characteristic, and it is the difference between these cuddly, lovely, wonderful sheep and those goats. And so keep that in mind. What does this verse have to do with me? He's going through and describing all of these works that the Savior is aware of. He's aware of your charity, he's aware of your service, he's aware of your faith, which also happens to, of course, be the first principle of the gospel. And we find this discussed and explained starting in Alma 32:21, where it says, "And now, as I said concerning faith, faith is not to have a perfect knowledge of things. Therefore, if ye have faith, ye hope for things which are not seen, which are true. Close quote. A similar statement is made in Ether chapter 12, verse 6, where it says, quote, and now I, Moroni, would speak somewhat concerning these things. I would show unto the world that faith is things which are hoped for and not seen. Wherefore, dispute not because ye see not, for ye receive no witness until after the trial of your faith. Close quote. And finally, if you go to Hebrews chapter 11, which is a big chapter by Paul on the subject matter of faith, it begins in verse 1 saying, quote, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Close quote. One other verse that I really like is in verse 6 of that same chapter that talks about, without faith it is impossible to please God. Close quote. And I remember that verse so well when I was on my mission in Holland, because we showed the old video in the movie, The First Vision. It starred Stuart Peterson, the guy that played in Where the Red Fern Glows. It just so happens that Stuart Peterson was a missionary in my mission, and he was a state champion wrestler from Wyoming, and I'm also originally from Wyoming, and so he one-upped me on that. I wrestled, but I wasn't that great, but he became a state champion, and we wrestled one day, but I'm getting off track, farther off than I anticipated. I want to focus on the movie, The First Vision, so at any rate, you'll remember in that version of it, as we got kind of the lead up to young Joseph Smith trying to figure out which church should I join. He's going to all these various congregations, and in one of them he's told, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And then the next scene, the woman says, saved by grace, not by works. That's how I remember that verse. That's when it came to my attention. But I digress. Let's get back on track and talk about another one of these works, is patience that the Savior sees in all of us. And so in Luke 21:19, it says, in your patience possess ye your souls. Close quote. I really like that verse. And coincidentally, it's also a verse that is quoted in That Thing You Do. And you remember when they were at the church recording their record, the question is asked, so when are we going to get this record? And the preacher who was helping them to record in his church says, in your patience possess ye your souls. And the bass player, whose name we never learn in the entire movie, he's only known as the bass player, then quotes and says, Luke 21:19. And Lenny, who's kind of the goofball in the group, said, Luke who? What? When are we going to get the record? And the guy says, on Wednesday. So at any rate, but I like that verse a lot. So in James 1:3-4, this is what it says about this concept of patience. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Close quote. And finally, in 2 Peter 1:6, where it says, and to knowledge add temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness. Close quote. So all of these things that we're talking about here, the charity, the service, the faith, the patience, all of these are attributes of godliness that we need to possess. If we are to be as Christ is and he possesses these qualities, then we can't be like him if we don't also possess these attributes. So if you want to be taught something about what you should be doing in your life, just think about what John is telling the Thyatiran saints, where he actually commends them for their works in these particular areas. And the hope would be that we would find ourselves in a position where, with these all-seeing eyes and his omniscience and his seeing our works, we would find possessed of these attributes as well. Which leads us into kind of the last phrase in this verse, where it says, the last to be more than the first. And this is where the Savior basically makes an interesting observation that as it relates to the Thyatiran saints, their works more recently were more praiseworthy than they had been formerly. And so that's pretty good praise indeed. And it happens to be opposite the condition of the saints in Ephesus. where they were condemned because they had lost their first love. In other words, they were not as fervent in their testimony in the end as they had been when they first joined the church and first gained their testimonies of the Savior Jesus Christ. And so, in the case of the Thyatiran, their most recent work, speaking collectively and not necessarily individually, had increased or improved more than they had been when they first came into the church. Now, they still have a ways to go. They still have some things that the Lord is going to condemn. And in fact, when we get back together tomorrow, unless you're listening to two podcasts in the same day, you have a situation where the Thyatiran saints were probably among the most wicked saints among the seven churches. And that's why this tends to be the longest letter, because most of the time is spent criticizing and condemning the Thyatiran saints for their egregious sins. And yet, despite the fact that they had these egregious sins that we'll talk about tomorrow, he's looking for the good in these people. And he says, you know, you've been doing better than you have in times past. And I think the Lord appreciates that, and that's something that we need to incorporate in our own lives. It's not always the place where we happen to be standing in the moment. The question is, what's our trajectory? What direction are we headed? Are we becoming elevated in our spirituality? Are we becoming, or are we stagnant, or are we falling back like the Ephesians? And so all of these things are the reason why I kind of said, think about how this applies to you. If the Lord was writing a letter to you today, what would it say? Makes you a little nervous. Are you one of those churches, individuals where he only has good things to say, he has only bad things to say? Hopefully not. Probably for most of it, it's going to be this combination where he's going to look for the good in us, but he's not going to hesitate the areas in which we could use a little improvement, or maybe a lot of improvement. So that's something that we can all work on, and we will continue to do so. Thanks for listening, subscribing, sharing. Thanks to Jenna for the technical stuff. Tomorrow we'll be discussing Revelation chapter 2, verses 20 and 23 that deal with this woman Jezebel, who is the antithesis of Lydia of Thyatira that I mentioned in this podcast. So keep her in mind, because tomorrow we'll be talking about her. I'll see you then.
For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is unveiling Jesus Christ.